Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching the 5th anniversary of the tragic air crash in Smolensk. And our event today is made all the more poignant in the light of the fatal air crash yesterday in the French Alps. Over 1,800 days have now passed since the 10th of April 2010, when Poland's President, the First Lady, and so many of the country's leading figures died in the forest on their way to commemorate the anniversary of the Katyn massacre. It was a deeply shocking tragedy for all of us, and for the Polish nation, it also sparked a period of intense grief. After a time, that grief began to give way to questions. Understandably, those families of the loved ones and the wider Polish community started to question how it was possible that a military aeroplane carrying so many eminent dignitaries on a mission of national commemoration could be lost in such a way. Unfortunately, 5 years later, there are still more questions than answers. The handling of the aftermath of the Smolensk crash was shocking. Conventions that should apply to air accident investigations were not applied in this case. Access to the site was not granted for Polish investigators. The black boxes have never been returned, and the wreckage was treated like scrap metal rather than with forensic precision. If any of you want to see details of these, there was a photographic exhibition by the G Block on the ground floor of the Parliament. When flight MH17 crashed, the black box was rightly returned within 5 months. We are now 5 years on, and the black box from the Tupolev 154 has never been returned to Poland. So for those of us here in the Parliament asking, what has this got to do with the European Parliament? Let us say this. How would you feel if your country had been treated in this unacceptable manner, as Poland has been treated following the tragic events in Smolensk? I would want answers, and I would expect our allies to push for answers as well. I'm sure all of us would want answers to this tragedy. So that is why we are here today, supporting not only our law and justice colleagues, but also the families of the 96 people on board that aeroplane and the people of Poland who lost so many of their leaders that tragic day, and want to ask a simple question: why? And can we get an answer to that very important question? Thank you. Can I call upon Professor Legutko to say a few words?
Thank you. What we witnessed just before the crash and after the crash was, I'm sorry to say, the failure of the Polish state institutions. But paradoxically, as it were, this unimaginable tragedy initiated an avalanche of civic initiatives. People from various professions and occupations, university professors, engineers, journalists, people of goodwill, decided to do the job which should have been done by the government and its institutions. And 5 years after the tragedy, we know more than we did when the tragedy happened. And it is largely due to those courageous people who, despite the obstacles, political, despite or social or legal, who, despite being vilified by the politician and by the servile media, continue to do the job. And let me repeat, it is thanks to them that we know more than we did 5 years ago. And if there is some ground for optimism, it is here. Thank you.
Can I call upon our first speaker, Mr. Maciewicz, who is a Polish politician, a historian and a lecturer, and was the Minister of the Interior from 1991 to 1992. Also the Deputy Minister of National Defence in 2006 and 2007, and headed the Military Counterintelligence Service from 2006 to 2007. He's a long-standing Member of Parliament and the Vice President of the Law and Justice Party. He's also widely published in Polish newspapers and was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Order of the Rebirth of Poland on May the 3rd, 1990, by the President of the Republic of Poland in exile. In July 2010, he became the chairman of the Polish Parliamentary Committee into the investigation of the 2010 crash in Smolensk, Russia. Mr. Maciewicz.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to thank you for presenting to all of us in your opening remarks the data on the Smolensk crash. What you said was very dignified. And I think those were the words that Poles and many Europeans have been waiting for quite some time, for many years, actually. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor today to present to you a lot of material which intends to sum up the work that had been done by independent scientists, by all people of goodwill who have tried to contribute to solving the problems that are still outstanding. And the materials have been published under the name of Professor Nowaczyk. He collected them in one publication and they are now available. That document attempts to answer basic questions that we had already asked ourselves on the 10th of April, at the very moment when we learned about this horrible tragedy. Today, 5 years down the road, a lot of work has been done, but mostly not by the state. It was all work carried out by people of goodwill. And we can confirm 3 facts. First and foremost, it is the government who is to blame for the tragedy, the government of Mr. Putin. At that time, the Prime Minister of the government of the Russian Federation, and today the President of the Russian Federation. Secondly, what happened over Smolensk on the 10th of April 2010 was not a mere accident. Neither was it caused by mistakes or errors committed by the pilots. It was a activity orchestrated, I would say, a first blow in the war that is being waged right now in the east of Europe, and that is dramatically advancing towards the borders of the EU and the NATO countries. And in this context, I would like to thank very warmly indeed all the institutions of the EU, all the officials of the EU and NATO who at that time, on the 10th of April 2010, decided to participate in the inquiry, to ask questions in order to solve the mystery of this tragedy. And at the same time, I want to say the following. Vladimir Putin and his government unfortunately refused to help, and many efforts had been nipped in the bud. So many members of organizations that were supporting us were excluded actually from the meetings on which the details of the tragedy were being discussed. And until today, we don't know them. There is no doubt whatsoever that if an international inquiry had been started, like in the case of MH17 plane, we wouldn't be seeing Donbas war, the annexation of Crimea, or the shooting down of the Dutch plane, nor would we see the death of Mr. Nemtsov. A crime that goes unpunished tends to be repeated. And now I would like to present to you a video that attempts to be a reconstruction of the tragic events of the 10th of April 2010.
April 2010. A date that no Pole should let pass unnoticed. 7:27 a.m. A government aircraft Tu-154M with President Lech Kaczynski on board takes off from Warsaw Chopin Airport and heads towards Smolensk North Airport, Severna, in Russia. On the surface, everything seemed to be running smoothly. Nobody expected that this day would live in infamy in our country's history. Perhaps events would have taken a different course had the government not organized separate visits for Prime Minister Tusk and President Kaczynski. The tragedy certainly would not have occurred if Interpol's warning of the threat of a terrorist attack had been taken seriously. However, we were less than an hour away from the greatest aviation disaster to befall the Polish Air Force in its history, and the greatest tragedy in the history of independent Poland. How is it possible that, 4 years after the tragic flight, fundamental questions remain unanswered? Why is the main evidence regarding the wreckage, the so-called black boxes and navigation instruments, are still not in the hands of Polish authorities? Why is it not possible to conclude the investigation and to give a clear explanation of the causes of the disaster? Why did the Prosecutor General not scrutinize and examine the wreckage in its entirety, ignoring sections that were burned and blown apart by an explosion? Why didn't the Prosecutor General scrutinize the original black boxes, or did not carry out autopsies, or create a reconstruction of the wreckage? Indeed, why is the Prosecutor General still refusing to investigate the most likely cause of the disaster, an explosion in the final stage of the flight? Do we not, as a nation, deserve to find out the truth? The parliamentary group established to investigate the causes of the Tu-154M disaster of 10th of April 2010 has created a visualization of the most likely scenario for the final seconds of the government aircraft's flight. What we find today in the location where the Russians have gathered parts of the aircraft wreckage, they are in fact only incomplete remnants which have been destroyed, premeditatedly and on many occasions, under any possible pretext. Significant parts are missing from the fuselage covering, especially from the upper section, the President's cabin and the cockpit, which were ripped apart and crushed, as well as the left and right wings and the midsection. What happened to the missing parts? Archaeologists identified some of them 3 months after the disaster. Independent scientists are in no doubt that the only possible cause of such severe damage was a number of explosions. They ripped apart the aircraft, which fell apart into over 60,000 fragments. Lieutenant Rafał Kowaleczko, crew member of the Yak-40 aircraft. I'm in shock the whole time, and I can't get over it. People have to find out what it was like there. Even now, all I hear is that all the blame lies with the Polish pilots. But here at the airport, there were some weird things going on with the handling of the flight that need to be explained. We now know that guidance of the Polish government aircraft was taken over by the Moscow Air Traffic Control Operations Center, codenamed Logika, which was commanded by General Vladimir Benediktov. It was his orders that were being followed by Major Krasnokutski, who unexpectedly appeared in the control tower in Smolensk and took over command. It was he who ordered the aircraft to be brought into land, even though air traffic controllers felt that it should be sent to an alternative airport. Air traffic controllers from Smolensk Pavel Plusnin and Viktor Rezenko asked Moscow at several points to indicate alternative airports and to close Smolensk North Airport. However, Moscow refused, and Krasnokutsky ordered the aircraft to be brought in to land without discussion. Meanwhile, the Polish crew had no intention to land. Given the prevailing weather conditions, Major Protashuk issued an order to the crew 9 minutes before the disaster to prepare and get ready for a go-around maneuver, abort landing and circle the airport around. In the event of a missed approach, we leave on autopilot. Given the prevailing conditions, the entire procedure should have been carried out with more prior notice from the Russian control tower. Additionally, when the Tu-154M was at a distance of 9 kilometers from the airport, the crew was erroneously informed by air traffic controllers that the aircraft was on track. The aircraft should be guided by the controller along a descent path of 2 degrees 40 minutes. The actual descent path was 3 degrees 12 minutes. Due to the air traffic controller's errors, the pilots did not have sufficient time to stabilize their navigation instruments. At no point were they on path and on course. The aircraft's landing point was almost 1 kilometer closer than the actual beginning of the runway. With 2 minutes to go before the disaster, a series of misleading pieces of information were given to the crew. The tower stated 8 on path and on course. In reality, however, the Tu-154M was 130 meters above the path and had strayed from the course by 80 meters. The subsequent information was also misleading. Continue your approach, on path and on course, distance 6. At that moment, the aircraft was 120 meters above the path and 120 meters to the side of the center line of the runway. The crew of the Polish Yak-40 aircraft mentioned finding the aircraft to the left of the runway. Ensign Remigiusz Musz, technician on the Yak-40 aircraft. We decided to head to the scene of the crash. It became apparent that the site was not 1,500 meters away, as we had previously been informed, but 400 to 500 meters from the start of the runway, and 50 meters to the left of the direction of landing. Now just over 20 seconds remain until the catastrophe. The pilots decided at an altitude of 100 meters to go around, stop descent and circle the airport. However, their instruments were not following their commands, and the aircraft continued to descend. The commander of the Polish aircraft gave out the order, "Go around." This command was repeated 1 second later by the second pilot. Despite this, the aircraft continued to descend. The plane navigator read out the distance of the approaching ground, and the TAWS alarm started to sound. Pull up. After reaching 30 meters above runway level, the pilot manually pulled up the machine. The aircraft then reached 20 meters before finally starting to pull up as part of a going around and abort of landing procedure. When the Tu-154M passed the nearest radio beacon, a series of shocks occurred that were caused by an explosion on the wing. The aircraft started to veer dangerously to the left. The following shocks destabilized the aircraft, and the damaged engines started to cut out and interrupt, causing the aircraft to rapidly lose altitude. As a result of the damage, the aircraft veered more pronouncedly, while the remains of the ring and the stabilizer crashed into trees, as well as onto roofs of garages and huts, causing further damage. This is how that moment was described by the air traffic controllers, who had, at that very moment, lost the Polish Tu-154M from sight. "Where is it?" asked Krasnokutsky. "It just flew past the nearby radio beacon. It will be on the left, somewhere beside the road. It started to pull up to make another approach and then fell." Anatoly Zuyev, witness: "We were standing on the edge of the garage. We could not see anything, no aeroplane, nothing. The sound of the aeroplane was rather flat, beautiful and soft. I went off to take a look, but I could not see it. Suddenly the motors roared as much as they could, and the aeroplane held together as best it could. It flew on like that for a moment, passing us in a flash. Then there was an explosion, yellow, like the yolk of an egg. It was round, and that was it." Sergei Vandarov, Witness, owner of a detached house. This day will remain in my memory until the end of my days. I saw the disaster with my own eyes. It occurred right in front of my house. I live barely 400 meters from the site of the disaster. That Saturday morning, I was in front of the house when I suddenly heard a terrible rumbling sound. An aircraft appeared in the foggy sky. An aircraft like any other, I thought. Given that I live just a few hundred meters from the airport, I've been able to get used to such a sight. However, there was one thing that stunned me. At a certain moment, the roar simply disappeared. Literally, for a split second, there was an eerie silence above the forest. I turned my head and saw a falling aeroplane. My legs gave way beneath me. A moment later, there was an awful roar, and the glow of a fire appeared among the trees. I cannot believe what happened. I particularly cannot believe that the tragedy took place before my very eyes and right in front of my house. The Tu-154M was passing the Gubenko Highway. It was here that the end of the left wing fell off after being damaged during the explosion. It was found less than 20 meters away on the ground. A hail of fragments struck nearby trees, fences, and hut roofs. Fragments also struck the stabilizer. The aeroplane's left engine was also damaged. Igor Fomin, witness, mechanic. The aeroplane was making a strange noise as it flew, a loud whistling, crackling sound. It sounded like gunfire. Then there was a thud and flames shot out. The pilots lost control of the aeroplane, which violently changed course. 150 meters from the highway at an altitude of 16 meters from the airport's runway, there was an explosion in the rear section of the fuselage, which caused it to detach from the aeroplane. The explosion also ripped off the aeroplane's tail and caused the stabilizer to break off. Nikolai Shevchenko, witness, local bus driver. It was at a height of 12 to 13 meters when it started to turn due to the absence of the wing. It struck a tree, which caused it to straighten out. It flew over the road and then something fell off it, a part of the tail. It then struck the ground just beyond the road. Marif Ipatov, witness. I saw the aeroplane flying away. It was going so low and it fell apart. It lurched. I noticed that something serious was happening. It was creaking, creaking. Then there was a noise like a bomb. Lieutenant Rafał Kowaleczko, crew member of the Yak-40 aircraft. Once we had landed, some of us stood by the airport's runway and waited for the Tu-154M. The pilots returned to the aeroplane and communicated with the crew of the presidential aircraft over the radio. They learned from us that there was fog and that the conditions were bad. However, they did not panic. Less than 20 minutes later, we heard the sound of the Tu-154M approaching the airport. Initially, the sound was completely normal and the engine was running normally. At a certain moment, though, there was a bang from the engine similar to the sound made when the engine starts up. We knew immediately that something was wrong. A moment later, we heard the sound of 2 explosions, followed by some thuds. Then everything went silent. We were terrified, as we knew that a disaster had occurred. Once the rear section of the fuselage had exploded and the tail had been ripped off, another explosion occurred that completely destroyed the aeroplane. The center section of the wing and the fuselage were destroyed and fell in an inverted position. The fuselage lining was totally ripped apart, in particular the president's cabin and the cockpit, most of which was never found. The parts that were saved struck the ground in a normal position. Ensign Remigiusz Musz, technician on the Yak-40 aircraft. We left the aeroplane to look for the Tupolev. The weather and the visibility deteriorated further. I returned to the aeroplane and broadcasted, "Arek, visibility is at 200 over the radio." He responded by saying thanks. I then returned before the aeroplane. Several minutes later, we heard the characteristic whistling sound of the Tupolev engines, typical due to the reduced number of revolutions associated with descent. Suddenly, the revolutions increased to the maximum. 2 seconds later, there was some blow and 3 explosions, and then there was a brief sound of one of the engines stalling. Then there was silence. The other torn-off fragments were found about 30 meters apart from each other. These fragments were a section of the starboard of the presidential cabin and toilet with windows, the starboard with some of the writing Republic of Poland, blind doors, the president's sofa. 30 meters from the board in the 4th sector, the body of the President of the Republic of Poland, Lech Kaczynski, was found. Clear signs of an explosion were noted in the form of incineration, tearing, carbonization and sooting, all of which testified to the effects of fire underneath and on the surface of the inverted center section of the wing and the right wing, and above all, on the internal surface of the wall of the president's cabin. As the Russian experts later ascertained, both wings had been ripped apart by a pressure wave from inside, which resulted in the frame being ripped apart and destroyed, and in the upper wing casing being blown outwards. This fact was ignored by the Polish prosecutor's office, the Anadina report, Russian, and the Miller report, Polish. Lieutenant Artur Vosztyl, pilot of the Yak-40 aircraft. As we were standing by our plane, we heard the sound of the Tu-154's engines as it approached to land. I recognized it from the characteristic sound of its engines. I should point out that I did not see it. I only heard it. It was the sound of an approach to land at a fixed engine output level. At one point, I heard the engine go into the range associated with ignition. It was as if the pilot wanted to increase the revolutions in order to straighten out the plane or to pull up. At that point, I wondered what could have caused them to take such a step and decision. A few seconds after the revolutions were increased, I heard loud bangs, roars, and detonations. Then there was the sound of the engine fading out before everything went quiet. I found these sounds terrifying, and I hope that I will never hear them again in my life. The passengers of the Tupolev had no chance, and to this day we do not know the circumstances of their deaths. In any case, the time entered in all of the death certificates was 8:10:50, i.e. 9 minutes after the plane crashed into the ground. All of the deaths were attributed to injuries to multiple organs, regardless of whether the cause of death was being torn apart, as occurred in the rear section of the plane, being burnt to death, as occurred in the central section of the plane, or as yet unknown causes of the head injuries sustained by one Government Protection Bureau agent in the front of the aircraft. The body of President Lech Kaczynski was found roughly 4 hours after the rescue mission was called off. Of the 96 victims, 89 were not subjected to post-mortem examinations.
Нихуя себе! Нихуя себе!
On 10th of April 2010, 96 people from the elite of the Polish state died in the greatest tragedy to befall Poland since it regained its independence. The President of the Republic of Poland, Professor Lech Kaczynski, and his wife Maria. The President in exile of the Republic of Poland, Ryszard Kaczorowski. Generals of the Polish Armed Forces, chaplains of the Polish Armed Forces, the Vice-Chancellor of Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University, clergymen, ministers, the President of the Supreme Audit Office, the President of the National Bank of Poland, the Ombudsman, parliamentarians, independence campaigners and Solidarity co-founder Anna Walentynovich. The animation entitled How the President of Poland Died was created by the parliamentary group established to investigate the causes of the Tu-154M disaster of 10th of April 2010 under the guidance of Antony Macierewicz. and was the first multimedia reconstruction of the final seconds of the government aircraft. Consultants: Professor Kazimierz Nowacek, coordinator of the group of technical advisors; Professor Wiesław Benienda, Dr. Wacław Boczynski, Dr. Bogdan Gajewski, Dr. Gregory Shuladziński, project manager; Bartłomiej Misiewicz, bureau chief of the parliamentary group established to investigate the causes of the Tu-154M disaster of 10th of April 2010.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much indeed. As you might have known, the body of Madam Anna Walentynowicz, the co-founder of Solidarity Movement, has until now not been found.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Bogdan Gajewski, who's one of the experts in the Polish Parliamentary Committee for the investigation into the 2010 crash. He's a senior engineer in the Canadian Government Agency. Can you hear me okay? Is this irritating or is it okay? It's fine, is it? Okay. And he's a senior engineer in the Canadian Government Agency and a member of the International Society of Air Safety Investigators, which brings together experts investigating air crashes from around the world. Since the 1980s, he's been living in Canada, working on air accident investigations. He's also a member of the Polish community organisations in Canada and the Association of Polish Engineers in Canada. Can I hand over to Mr. Gajewski, please?
Thank you very much. My name is Bogdan Gajewski. My aviation background spans for over 40 years, with the last 25 years as a continuing airworthiness senior engineer for the Government of Canada. In today's world of civil aviation, we face increasing amounts of interference with military activities with tragic results. Case 1. On 22nd November 2003, an Airbus cargo plane owned by European Air Transport was struck by a Russian-made missile. Fortunately, an experienced crew of 3, 2 Belgians and a Scot, managed to land safely. Case 2. On 17th July 2014, the Malaysian airliner flight MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine, killing all 298 people on board. Case 3. On 10th April 2010, a Polish aircraft crashed in Smolensk, Russia, killing all 96 people aboard. Naturally, we are very concerned about the lives of all passengers. We should not allow these kinds of tragedies to ever happen again. We must learn our lessons from the accident reports. For case 3, the Polish aircraft Tupolev 154M, we can say that so far we have only one final accident report available to us. This report regarding the crash at the military airport in Smolensk, Russia, is the subject of my presentation. On 10 April 2010, Polish Tupolev 154M aircraft of the Polish Air Force crashed near the city of Smolensk, Russia, killing all 96 people on board. This included President of Poland, Lech Kaczyński, and his wife Maria, former President Richard Kaczorowski, the Chief of General Staff, and other senior Polish military officers. There were 88 passengers and a crew of 8. This is an accident aircraft. Aircraft took from Warsaw, Poland, flying to Smolensk, Russia. And this is an accident site at Smolensk. An investigation into this accident resulted in 2 official reports. The Russian report, known as a MAC report, and parallel report, the Polish report known as a Miller report. Both reports classified this accident as a controlled flight into terrain. This controlled flight into terrain described an accident in which an airworthy aircraft under pilot control is unintentionally flown into terrain, often referred as a pilot's error. The main principle of any crash investigation is, if a significant discrepancy is found in a report, the whole report should be rejected. This presentation shows some basic discrepancies found in these reports which doubt the professionalism and trustworthiness of the official investigation. Only basic items are presented to give an overall impression of the quality of these reports. The following information was evaluated: crash site inventory, cabin arrangement, time of the accident, black box readouts, and investigation procedure. Crash site inventory. And this is a crash site. Please pay attention on the fragments of the passenger seats. Please note that we see fragments of the seats only. The inventory of the crash site is fundamental for any crash investigation. Securing the crash site is paramount for further investigation. However, in this case, the crash site was not secured. Locals were allowed on the site, compromising vital evidence. This is case number 1. This is case number 2. This is case number 3. On these satellite pictures, we see that aircraft parts were moved. First picture on the bottom was taken on the 11th of April. Next day, this part, as marked in a red square, was moved. In a report, the second location of the part was mentioned. The following problems were noted. The crash site was not secured. Locals were allowed on the site, compromising vital evidence. The location of aircraft parts were altered, as shown on satellite pictures. The point of impact of the aircraft with the ground has not been determined. There were 2 Model Tupolev 15-4 aircraft, tail number 101 and 102, servicing Polish VIP government officials. As stated in both reports, of aircraft model Tupolev 15M number 101 had crashed in Smolensk. Each aircraft has carried a valid airworthiness certificate on his board. It's a mandatory document. The Russian report says that there were 2 airworthiness certificates found at the accident site. An invalid one for aircraft number 101 and a valid one for aircraft number 102. Aircraft 101 was recently overhauled. It means it should carry the actual certificate. And the aircraft 102 was in Russia in the process of being overhauled. This is an example, this is a snapshot of the Russian report. Conclusion. Their presence at the accident site suggests that these certificates were purposely placed, compromising the evidence. The investigation team was not able to explain why these documents were found at the accident site. Cabin arrangement. According to both reports, Tupolev number 101 with 88 passengers on board had crashed. However, there is a major discrepancy regarding the number of passenger seats in this aircraft. The Polish report states that 4 days before the accident, the aircraft was reconfigured to increase cabin capacity to 100 passenger seats. The Russian report says that only 90 passenger seats were on this aircraft. This is a snapshot of MAC report, which indicates 90 passenger seats on the second highlight row. Consequently, the Polish report talks about 12 empty seats, and Russian report talks about 2 empty seats. And this discrepancy was not explained. The Russian report lacks basic inventory data like the number of passenger seats found at the crash site. Despite this, the report claims that all the passenger seats were accounted for, with details that some of them were not buckled up before the crash. This statement does not address the existence of 12 empty seats listed in a Polish report. And this is a snapshot of MAC report. The Russian report states that almost all high-ranked officials, 2 delegation members and a cabin attendant were located in the forward part of passenger cabin based on crash inventory. However, the same report states that the boarding was conducted using boarding passes without specified seat numbers. So there is a question: how were the Russians able to determine the location of 2 delegation members and a cabin attendant despite the lack of assigned seat numbers? This is a snapshot of fragments from MAC report. This is an accident site. Passenger seats. Please note fragments of passenger seats on the fourth part of this picture. Conclusion. The aircraft seats configuration as well as the state of the safety belts before landing are a mystery. The time of the accident. The Russian Emergencies Ministry told ITAR-TASS news agency that plane crashed at 10:56 Moscow time as it was coming to land. This information was provided by BBC News. Okay, this is Euronews. Week later, the Euronews stated in their news that the time of the crash was 10:56 Moscow time, same time, week after accident. It turns out that the official time of the accident as 10:56 Moscow time was circulating around the world for 2 weeks. The time of accident is usually determined from the readouts from the flight data recorder and tape records from the control tower. And this is a typical control tower as perceived by travelers. And this is a Russian control tower at Smolensk at April 2010. 2 weeks after the accident, the official time of accident has been changed to 10:41, which is 15 minutes earlier than 10:56 reported for 2 weeks. This time difference has not been explained. Conclusion. For 2 weeks, the wrong time of the accident was widely publicized despite the earlier, presumably correct, readouts from the black boxes. Cockpit voice recording, black box readouts. As it was found later, there were 7 copies of the cockpit voice recording, each with different time lengths. Imagine, same voice data recorder, and we have 7 different copies of it. Also, there are 4 different versions of the last minutes of the recording. All these recordings were certified working copies of the aircraft cockpit voice recorder. Conclusions. There were no explanation of the different lengths of the recordings. There were no possibility to verify the original recording because the black boxes are still being held by Russians. Investigation procedure. The crucial point is to determine from the crash site inventory if any of the aircraft parts were found along the flight path before the point of initial contact with the ground. If some aircraft parts were found before the point of contact, there is a possibility that the aircraft was having technical difficulties, problems, and the pilot could have had difficulty in controlling the flight. It has been documented that many aircraft parts, including part of the wing and the horizontal stabilizer, were found well before the initial point of contact with the ground. Additionally, a serious electrical problems during flight was reported on page 107 of the Russian report, which says, the flight management system power was lost at 10:41:05 at altitude of 15 meters with speed of about 270 kilometers an hour. These findings suggest that the accident aircraft had some serious technical problems during flight, and the pilot may have lost control of the aircraft. And this is an aircraft part found well before the crash site. In fact, if in fact the pilot had lost control of the aircraft due to aircraft disintegration during the flight, the investigation team should explore a scenario of uncontrolled flight into terrain, where the pilot was not able to execute a normal landing. In such a case, the original claim of pilot's error is unfounded. Conclusion. Based on a crash site inventory results, the investigating team failed to explore the scenario of uncontrolled flight into terrain. Both accident reports fell short of the proper in-depth investigation. There were some basic discrepancies found in both official reports, which cast doubt on the professionalism and trustworthiness of the official investigation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And before I open up to questions and answers, can I hand over to Glenn Jorgensen, who's also... Is that better? They're all very loud. Mr. Jorgensen is also a member of the Polish Parliamentary Committee for the investigation into the crash. He's an engineer, a pilot, a businessman and an inventor. He graduated from the Danish Technical University and now leads a private company in Denmark which advises and develops engineering solutions on request. He presented a video drawing together the facts and research surrounding the events on April 10, 2010, of which the wider public were hitherto unaware. Mr. Jorgensen's first programme of the Smolensk air crash was aired in Denmark in March 2014 on one of the largest Danish radio stations and was listened to by a record number of listeners. Mr. Jorgensen, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Glenn Jorgensen. I am working independently on this matter, and I will show you some of the results from the latest work and the work within the last 3 years. It's, of course, very difficult to squeeze such amount into 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. I am a Master of Science Engineering within Fluid Mechanics, graduated from the Danish Technical University in 1988. I'm also a pilot for a small one-engine plane. I have educated students at the Danish Technical University as co-teacher within Fluid Mechanics. I have spent more than 3 years working on this Smolensk issue, and I have spent more than 1,200 hours here. When I started this work, I had no Polish connection whatsoever. I have no Polish relatives. I have no Polish business association or relations. I started this because my colleague of one of my customers in Norway within the oil sector kept coming to me with his questions about Smolensk, and to be honest, I thought this was conspiracy theory. So I wanted to get hold of some of the official data from the MAC report and prove to him that the Russian story could agree with the laws of physics. Working on the issue for some months, I had to tell him that he was right and I was wrong. And I will show you some of this work. All the work I've done here, I've done expenses from my own pocket, except this trip here to Brussels. I have traveled around presenting this, have got no money from no interests. I have worked together with a company who is a sub-supplier for Boeing, Metacomp in the States, and they have sponsored some of their work for this, because this is very heavy calculations. Some of the work has been done using a 3D model. I show you here in cruise mode and in the plane, Tupolev plane, in landing configuration. Very accurate model of the plane. And the results, these are a snapshot of the result from the company that can be used to determine what happens to a plane when it loses part of its wing. First of all, the work has been verified by calculating the lift power of the plane when it's in undamaged state. And this has been verified and held against the data that we know from well-known of this aircraft, with very good agreement. And then calculations have been done showing what happens when we cut, firstly, the wingtip, because the official MAC report is claiming that the plane crash was caused by the wingtip, the left wingtip of 5.5 meters being lost by hitting a birch tree in 5 meters height. So, just to show you how the official version, very short, is described, the pilots are flying from the left towards the right, and the runway 26 is not shown, but way out to the right side. And they are following a glide path that is within the lower and upper glide path region. All of us, and they are aiming for a decision height around 100 meters. The decision height is the height the pilots have to make a decision. Will they approach, will they continue to land, or will they do a go-around? As you heard, the fog around the Smolensk was very heavy. This was a local fog, and they were aiming, as the data show, towards this height. But all of a sudden, according to the official story, the pilots make a sudden move towards the ground, 2 kilometers before the runway. They claim to do a go-around at 65 meters height above the ground. And according to the official story, they hit some trees, and the plane is at this moment flying in auto control, according to the official story. And the plane is undamaged by this first contact with the trees. It hits a birch tree shown at the second star, the middle star at the ground. This is in 5 meters height. The plane makes a left roll of 150 degrees and hits the ground, killing all people on board. This is the official story. If we take a look at the effect of losing the 5.5 meter wingtip, and the wingtip is shown here as a circled part, you should note that this picture is the remainings we have, the picture of the remainings of the Tupolev, and note also the next section of the wing in all the tiny pieces. This is what I refer to as the additional wing loss. I will get back to this in a second. If only this wingtip that is circled was lost, as stated by the Russians, then the plane, according to the aerodynamics, would not crash. The plane would have sufficient remaining lift power to climb at least 20 meters above the crash site. And very importantly, the speed of the roll, this is the rotation the plane is making due to this wing loss, would be 30 to 50% less than recorded by the plane's black boxes. If the, and also important is the ground trace analysis shows that these ground traces, and these are the scratches in the ground shown on the left part. This is a satellite photo of the first contact the plane made with the ground, according to the Russians. These scratches in the ground are incompatible with the length the Russians are stating of this wing. The geometry the plane had cannot fit to these ground traces. Also, the black box data show us that there were two distinct wing losses. There was the loss of two distinct places where we lost the lift capacity. The first one shown fits very well with the loss of the wingtip. The second, and the plane is now here flying from left towards right on this curve. The second or even third occasion shows additional wing loss, and this fits very well with the area you see on this picture here circled in red. If we assume that both the wingtip and then 120 meters later this encircled area is lost, then we will get a perfect fit with the recorded roll of the plane and the calculated roll. The plane would crash regardless what the pilots do, so we have a case here that the pilots can no longer control the plane. And the black box data agree with the aerodynamics about the two distinct losses. The vertical speed towards the ground, the final second towards the ground, fits with the data we have from the black box, about 22 meters per second. The calculations show 23 meters per second. The ground traces fit perfectly with this configuration. So, conclusion, the plane lost about double the wing length than claimed by the Russians. Here I show what happened. Plane is flying in, loses the wingtip, starts a small roll, 20 degrees, loses a second part of the wing here, and this second part it loses, data show that this is not like a big blow taking away everything at once, but it is, as you saw in the movie shown by Mr. Masarevich, slowly break up of the wing. You will find wing fragments along the further path of the plane. Eventually it turns around, pilots can no longer control the plane. At this moment they will actually try to push the control column forward because the plane is inverted and it hits the ground in this position. Here is shown the statement by the official is that this happened in 5 meters height, hitting the birch tree you can see at the left bottom part. I've shown the size of the plane according to this photo, and the angle of this, according to the MAC report, is around 15 to 20 degrees inclination. So the motors are pointing directly to this Russian fence you can see built below the birch tree. When losing more wing, the plane will fly shorter, and of course, in order to reach the crash site, it has to be higher. So the less wing we have on the plane, the shorter it will fly, and to reach a certain distance, plane has to be higher. So from this we can calculate that the plane had to be at least 30 meters above this area of the birch tree. Actually, it would be even 30 meters to the side of this birch tree, and most likely around 55 meters height. In this height, there are no obstacles whatsoever that could cause this wingtip to be lost. The area around the birch tree lacks the sign of the 80-ton plane flying at 5 meter height with engines at full thrust at this inclination. And also, the line of cut of the wingtip is not in the direction of the flight, but 20 degrees off. And I will show to you that this is the only possibility if you want to cut this wingtip using explosives. Conclusion, the birch tree could not cause the loss of the wing. The loss of the wing happened well above the birch tree in free airspace without obstacles. This is in well agreement with Professor Wisław Pinienda from the Akron University in the States that has published, from his published article, proved that the birch tree had to be at least 4 times stronger in order to cut this wingtip. Let's take a small look at what happens when from the thrust power of this Tupolev, you have the 3 motors at the back, as you see here. These motors are running at full power, and the thrust power, just to give you a demonstration of the effect of this, you see a bus pulled behind the equal thrust power. This is an 11-ton American school bus, and it's pulled 40 meters behind such motor, equal to the thrust power of 3 Tupolev motors, and it's blown another 40 meters in the air. So, how does this fence look according to the Russians? This is the effect. As you can see, the Russians can build very strong fences. Official statement, the body exposure to over 100 G acceleration, body of the victims, was caused by hitting the ground. The main destruction of the plane was caused by hitting the ground. We know the vertical speed of the plane when hitting the soft ground cannot explain the 100g acceleration experienced by the victims. No crater was seen whatsoever. If the 80-ton plane hitting ground, resulting 100g exposure to the body, there should be a crater formed at least 1 to 2 meters. There is no crater. These are not my results, they are results from Wisław Benienda's work. So, conclusion, the body exposure to 100g acceleration, this is the value the Russians are claiming due to the investigation of the bodies. They can see what were these bodies exposed to. This was not caused by hitting the ground. Such large acceleration requires the generation of a massive force similar to an internal explosion, most likely occurring at the point where the scratches on the ground suddenly stop. And this is agreement with another conclusion by Professor Benienda, and you saw these in the presentation earlier, where the fuselage is opened prior to the contact with ground. This can only be done with an internal pressure. This can explain why the plane was found in 20 to 60,000 parts, some of them found deep into the ground, burnt. And it can explain why there was a rivet found during an exhumation of one of the victims. Another official statement, and I won't read all this, but just take the important part. The Russians are claiming that the pilots were acting with a clash of motives. This means that on the one hand, they wanted to do a go-around because they thought this was the most correct to do. On the other hand, they wanted to land. According to the Russians, they were acting under pressure from the president. We can see from the GPS data that the 3 independent GPS and from the variation in the radio height, that the pilots knew the height they were at. By the path they were approaching, as I showed on the first view graph, and even if they wanted to land, the sudden dive towards the ground makes no sense. Fog or no fog, pressure or no pressure. Calculating backwards from the crash site, this is one of the few information we know very well. Where did this plane actually crash? If we calculate and do the aerodynamics working backwards, reaching a certain height and position, this fits exactly with the position as given by the GPS. I'll show this in this view graph. You have the GPS positions as green boxes. The plane is flying from the upper right corner, passing along this yellow line. And the green are GPS measurements. Entering the middle marker zone, shown as these blue triangles, loses the left wingtip as at the first red star, loses the second part of the wing at the next red star. The blue trajectory is the calculated trajectory. If we take a look from the side here, we will see that the height around the entry to this middle marker zone seems to be around 75 meters, and allowing for, and this is data from the Russian report, that the go-around would cost about 20 to 25 meters height. There will be about 50 meters height at least at this exit of the middle marker zone, shown with the blue triangles. The GPS positions measured during the very last flight, you see them as the 3 green boxes, agree very well. And if we take a look at the trajectory as seen from above, you have the plane flying in from the right, the loss of the wingtip occurring. From the black box data shown at the bottom of this curve, we see that there's a distinct wing loss. We can see this on the sensors on board the plane, that something happened. And if you take a look at the ground pattern shown here encirculated with these brown dashed lines, it's very well in agreement with the toxification that will occur when the hydraulic oil and the fuel is spilled from the wing, because the wing contains also fuel. It's a fuel tank. So when you cut a part of the wing, some fuel will expose and be carried with the wind. The direction of wind is 120 degrees. These patterns fit perfectly with the 2 wing losses, and the huge pattern you see at the left is called zone 3, occurs at the moment when the calculations show the plane was rotated 90 degrees. So the remaining fuel inside the wing is now flowing out in huge mass, making the big vegetation damage. This picture is taken 2 months after the crash. So the ground traces fit, the fact that we find wing parts before the birch tree fit, the GPS positions fit, the final FMS measured velocity towards the ground fits with calculations, and even the position where the left wingtip would hit the ground fits with where we can see the ground scratch starts. Here, if we take a close look at the data given in the MAC report of this part of the wing, it's the left corner, you can see this is bent back. It shows contact with ground. It has been hitting as the corner you can see on the upper right picture, and the part of the wing, as I mentioned, the central part, you see the top of this is in tiny small fragments showing the clear sign of explosion, and they are not contaminated with the dirt. They do not show evidence of being in ground contact. The bottom part shows, and very importantly, the slats in front of the wing, you see the distinct mark where it has been in ground contact to the left and not to the right. All this fit perfectly with this hypothesis. Here I'm showing how in 1991 the British were doing experiments how to cut up a plane with what is called directional explosives. You can cut through almost anything without damaging the surroundings, here shown also on a yellow piece of steel. And I will get back to this, how to cut the wing using such explosives, because to make a long story short, when you do the engineering on this, there's only this one possibility to cut the wing from point C towards this arrow at the bottom where it says exit point, because the other alternatives would be you'd have to cut through moving parts of the plane, and this is not very ideal because cutting through a moving part will make this exposed, these explosives be exposed. If you can keep the explosions within the wing tank, the likelihood of this being detected would be minimal. So this leads us to this green line as the only possibility if you want to cut this wing using explosives. If you take a look at the bottom left corner, you will see the wingtip is cut by exactly this line. Even there will be the problem with this small corner, as I showed the problem area here. You see the photo to the right. This should have been damaged by the birch tree. If the birch tree had cut through the wing, there is no sign of damage whatsoever. Here is another part. I will, due to the time limitation, go very brief through this. This is just showing that the major left part of the wing shows signs that clearly indicate there was an explosion at this point, throwing this piece of the wing outwards and giving this the damage that we can see it ended with. Here I'm showing, I won't go through all these, but just to give you an overview of the, I've just listed here 26 what I find as important items where the MAC report and the Polish report can give no good explanation, and where the independent work done by many independent engineers and scientists and Masarevic group can give clear answers to these important observations and questions. And conclusion, 2 or more explosions occurred in free airspace with no obstacles. The crash was not an accident. And here I would like to just give you a small picture of what happened here, because the night before the plane left, there was no surveillance of who had access to this plane. Imagine Obama, he comes to this plane in the morning, he's going to Europe to visit you. The intelligence people tell him, Mr. Obama, we had this warning from Interpol during the night, and we don't know who was near your plane, but you get up and fly anyway. This is what happened in Poland. Need of a proper independent international investigation with full access to all data. And here I can mention I was handed just the other day 360,000 signatures gathered in 3 months by Mr. Andrzej Melak in 2011. He is the brother to one of the victims. He gathered these in 3 months in favor of such independent international investigation. Now, as the independent investigator, I have some 4 important questions I would like to ask Mr. Donald Tusk, and I cannot find a better place to do this than here. Being aware that neglecting to protect Polish interests as Prime Minister of Poland by Polish law can be punished with up to 10 years prison, on which legal ground and for which reasons did you, 1, agree with Mr. Putin to leave the investigation in the hands of Mr. Putin and the Russians without equal Polish participation and obstruct proper investigations? 2, forbid the coffins to be opened on arrival to Poland. This is the fact. Nobody was allowed to look into the coffin of their loved ones. Neglect to take actions for performing the correct medical investigations of the victims, finding the cause of death as they arrived to Poland, as they should have done according to Polish law. Neglect to respond to the severe break in security as the president's plane was allowed to departure, given the safety and integrity of the plane was put at stake the night before the flight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 to 12 minutes for any questions or answers. Can I ask you to keep them brief? Please notify Frank at the front. It's open to everyone. And please, can I ask people to keep their comments short? And if you want to address it rather than to everyone, to specific people on the panel, please indicate that as well. So the first speaker is Wojciechowski. Mr. Wojciechowski.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This is not a question. This is just a way to complement what has been said. I would like to thank our speakers for these extensive presentations. They all help to reveal the truth. What I want to say is this. As far as I know from the correspondence that I am having with the Polish interested parties, from the government's commission and from the public prosecutor's office, I can tell you that the knowledge gives rise to really horrible conclusions. The commission that presented the report has not been there on the crash site to see it, actually. We have never learned any names of experts who could possibly see the crash site. No one is deeming it possible that it could be an explosion, that it was a coup d'etat. Nothing like that was ever taken up on numerous suggestions. It was all deemed an accident, and I'm afraid similar mistakes have been committed by the public prosecutor's office. I have directed many official letters to the prosecutors, and we have learned that this unfortunate birch tree had been seen by the public prosecutor's office in 2011, in December. In 2011, almost 2 years after the crash, and the first investigation on the presence of any explosive materials have been done also almost 2 years after the crash. This is really horrible. This is with great regret that I have to speak about it, but I lament all that has happened, and it just goes to show that we need a proper international investigation. Whatever has happened in the workings of the government committee, and whatever has happened during the works of investigating committee in Poland and in Russia cannot account for all the questions. The autopsy has been conducted on the body of President Lech Kaczyński with the presence of the members of the prosecutor's office, but that was the only body that was being autopsied with the presence of the officials. They were not present at any other autopsy conducted afterwards, and any evidence was just taken blindly as given by the Russians. So what we need is really an international concerted effort to try and establish the truth.
Try and take it in threes if there are. And if you could just indicate until Frank acknowledges you. The next two speakers are Ashley Fox, who's the leader of the British Conservative MEPs here, and Mrs. Gojewska, who has tragically lost her husband in this tragedy. Ashley Fox first.
Thank you, Chairman. And on behalf of the British delegation, may I thank our Polish colleagues for this important presentation today. I want to assure our friends in Law and Justice of our continued support in your search for the truth. And certainly, having heard the presentation today, I would support your call for an independent international inquiry. My first question is to Mr. Jorgensen, and you explained how you started off by believing this was a conspiracy theory. You wanted to prove the Russian version of events was true, and you were unable to do so. Can you explain to me, you said that the wing was lost because of an explosion. Is it possible that that was a mechanical failure and an explosion? Can you disprove that theory? Or can you positively assert it must have been an explosive device in the plane? And secondly, a question to Mr. Masasevich. I understand that there's a book written by Mr. Jürgen Roth, a German author, who introduces documents available to the German security services. I wonder, are you familiar with these documents, and what are your views on them?
Thank you, Ashley. And before I ask the panel to answer the questions, can I hand over to Beata Koziewska, please?
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to express my words of welcome and gratitude to all the experts who have been relentlessly pursuing the truth for almost 5 years now. Thank you very much indeed on behalf of all the families who have lost their near and dears. So basically that would be all. Thank you very much for this support. Maybe one more thing. My colleague has already mentioned that there was a Polish and Russian investigation, but all the Polish investigation is being carried on the basis of materials that are being provided and then tampered with, I imagine, by the Russians. This is not a real investigation because the Polish interested parties only get what Putin decides is fit for sending to the Poles. This is not a way to investigate any crash. And after 5 years, as someone who has lost my family there, I can only conclude that our basic rights, fundamental human rights, are being trampled on. We have the right to hear the reason of this crash, and I think that there are many countries, even sometimes by us deemed as third world countries, where law is observed during an investigation like this, and here there is no law. Law is being trampled on. There is a conspiracy of silence, and there are many people who just refuse to hear the truth. To them, the truth is what is being presented by Putin and by Madame Anodina. The then Prime Minister Donald Tusk Mr. Jorgensen mentioned 10 years in prison, but let's look at him and where he is now. He is in high post in the European institutions. And that was, the plane, the aircraft was a government aircraft. The government was responsible for the aircraft. And Tusk and Putin just decided they would investigate the crash on the basis of a convention on civil flights, and then the Russians changed their mind. No, it won't be the convention, it will be annex number 13 to this convention. This is an outrageous ignoring of basic human rights. So let me thank again everyone who is trying to investigate and bring up the truth. No matter where such crash occurs, everyone should be interested in knowing the truth. if there had been at the time support from the EU or from NATO, maybe it would be different now. Maybe there would be no war in the Ukraine. Maybe we would have been able to protect the life of thousands of innocent people.
Mrs. Goszewska, can I just reiterate our admiration for the courage of you and also other families of the victims of this tragedy. You've been brave enough to speak out and continue the awareness so that we recognise how important this issue is, not only to you personally and to your families, but also to the Polish nation. So thank you very much for the brave work that you do in this area. Can I just very quickly, because we've only got 4 minutes, turn to the experts to answer? I'm sorry, we have to close the meeting at, just before 3 o'clock to allow people to start in session. So why don't we talk to Mr. Jorgensen and then Mr. Gajewski and then Mr. Maciejewicz, if we have time. And just to guide you, I will put the clock on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would just like to comment what was said here lastly, because I feel I cannot get through to the Polish mainstream media telling these data. I have to go travel through Poland as the independent meeting with people, and here I meet this argument that such work that I am doing and others are doing is dividing the Polish society. To me, not having the truth laid forward is the division of the Polish society. Okay, to answer the question, we know for a fact that there were built thousands of Tupolevs. We know they were flying in all kinds of weather, much, much more rough. This was a very calm day, and they have never, ever reported wingtip loss like this. If there would be the fatigue issue, I am sure they would have discovered this during the 6 months earlier visit at the Russian aviation plant, where this wing was taken apart. We know this from the protocols. This wing was taken apart by the Russians. There were not the adequate number of Polish guards to make sure that this plane could be under surveillance 24/7. Put together, the only way, as engineer, I tried to describe this. I can go in detail with this, but I, due to the time limitation, can tell you that this is the only way. If you want to cut this wing, you will do it like this. If there was the fatigue issue, there would be a cut. Even if they didn't find this, there would be not a cut on a 20-degree line with the direction of flight. So to me, this we know for a fact. The plane lost its wingtip in free airspace, no obstacles. I'm open for any other version you might come forward with, but to me, I only know one thing that could cause this, and this is cutting by explosives. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gajewski, do you want to add anything to that at all?
Oh, there are no questions to me, so...
Okay, fine. It's Maciejewicz.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much, President. Yes, I am familiar with many publications of Mr. Jürgen, who is one of the most outstanding German investigative journalists. His area of work is Russian mafia and the dealings of Gazprom in the working of the secret services of Russian Federation. Yes, I am familiar with the works of Mr. Roth. I know that he was gathering material to the book about Smolensk. I know that he was talking to the families and to the members of the parliamentary group. I do know that they contain materials that have come from the German intelligence officers. I do not know the materials themselves. I do not know the book as such, but it is supposed to be publicized highly as an event on the 8th of April in Germany. As far as what Madame Goszewska has said, it's worthwhile mentioning one thing. The black boxes were found 1 hour after the tragedy. They were removed from the crash site. The readouts were already available at 5 p.m. The same afternoon. And then, imagine, they were brought again to the crash site, and when at the 9 p.m. of the same day the Polish delegation showed up, they were led to the crash site. The seals were taken off again from the black boxes, and they were then officially opened in the place of investigation. That was just a theater.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to close up now, but can I thank our speakers, Mr. Macierewicz, for your perspective from as chairman of the Polish Parliamentary Committee into the investigation into this terrible tragedy. And can I also thank Mr. Gajewski and Ms. Jorgensen for their very thorough presentations, and also to highlight a point that I thought was very important that Mr. Jorgensen said, that he came to this investigation assuming there was, well, not assuming, but believing that actually he believed the Russian version of events. Was this a conspiracy theory? And what was very interesting was the way that in the thoroughness of his investigation, he found that there clearly is a case to be answered, and that has been laid out by all three speakers today. Can I thank my Law and Justice colleagues for bringing this issue to our attention and making sure that we are aware of it in this Parliament, and thank all of you who have made the effort to be with us here today. Thank you very much.